the U.S. election is shaping up to be the most consequential in recent history. What will this election mean for the future of the United States, and what will be the impact on the rest of the world? You're about to find out. I'm Dan Barclay, CEO of BMO Capital Markets, and on behalf of everyone at BMO, we're proud to support the Globe and Mail U.S. Election Dialogues. These webcasts bring together some of the most seasoned professionals in policy, politics, and journalism in a series of live discussions and debates on this election. You're in for a treat. Today's discussion is on the historical significance of the 2020 U.S. election, and who better to give us a perspective on this than the presidential historian, international keynote speaker, Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times #1 best-selling author, Doris Kearns Goodwin. We're glad you could join us. Enjoy the event.
Welcome to U.S. Election Dialogues. I'm Doug Saunders, the International Affairs columnist for the Globe and Mail, and I'll be hosting today's interview with presidential biographer Doris Kearns Goodwin. This is the first in a series of 3 U.S. election dialogues that the Globe and Mail and BMO have partnered in hosting. Event number 2, on October 15, will explore the economic implications of the 2020 election. It will feature the Globe and Mail's Rita Trichur in combination with Gary Cohn, former director of the National Economic Council and a former advisor to President Donald Trump. Event number 3, on October 29th, will be a panel featuring Bob Woodward, the legendary Washington Post writer of Watergate fame and author of the sensational new book, Rage. Bob will be in conversation with other journalists talking about reporting on the 2020 election and the role of journalism itself in 2020 and beyond. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Doris Kearns Goodwin. Over the last 4 decades, her work has come to define the genre of presidential biography and has had a great influence on the way we think about political history. It often has influenced the thinking and actions of presidents themselves. Her books are hugely enjoyable works of literature and have redefined our thinking about the role and milieu of U.S. presidents. Doris, as she always prefers to be known, earned a PhD in government from Harvard University and worked as a White House staffer under Lyndon Johnson. In 1976, she first turned her attention to the questions of executive leadership with a definitive biography of LBJ, followed over the next 3 decades by epic biographies of John F. Kennedy and his political family, of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, a work that was awarded the Pulitzer Prize, of Abraham Lincoln, and of Theodore Roosevelt. Her current book, Leadership in Turbulent Times, draws on her research into Lincoln, both Roosevelt's and Johnson, to explore the nature and practice of leadership with an eye to shaping the present day. Presidential leadership, she writes, is a mirror in which people see their collective reflection. As we peer into the very dark mirror of America's latest leadership contest, I can't think of a better guide. So let me connect you with Doris Kearns Goodwin. Doris, thank you for taking the time to join us.
I'm very glad to be with you, Doug, and to be with everybody out there.
Doris, the whole world is watching the United States this month. It's campaigning, its debates, as it goes into an election that to many feels unprecedented, both the controversy of the incumbent, the level of polarization and division we're seeing in American voters. I know there have been elections before that have felt like a referendum on a single controversial figure, but this time the stakes feel exceptionally high. Having chronicled so many elections, do you feel like this one is unique?
It does feel to many of us as if it is unprecedented, but it's true, as your question suggests, that we have been through situations in the past where an incumbent was running in the middle of a crisis. And I think maybe there are some lessons to be learned from that. I mean, think about FDR running in 1932. The stock market had collapsed in 1929. We had been in a depression for nearly 3 years. The federal government under Republican Hoover had not been able to have national direction for what should happen, believing only the states and the cities should take care of themselves. And so that election turned essentially on his handling of that depression crisis. And it, of course, turned out to be a landslide for Franklin Roosevelt. So in those moments of crisis, and I still think that's going to be true today, despite all the distractions, the handling of the crisis, the way in which President Trump has, or has not handled it correctly will be the way people vote. Similarly, in 1864, it's amazing to remember that in August of 1864, everybody on the Republican Party leadership thought that Abraham Lincoln would lose the election. They came to him and they told him, the war is going badly. It's despite the victory at Gettysburg the year before. Hundreds of thousands are dead. Grant is stuck in Petersburg. There's no forward movement. It feels like your Emancipation Proclamation has only prolonged the war because the South will never come to the bargaining table. Your only chance to win this election is to call a peace conference for only restoring the Union, putting emancipation off. He actually said to them, just leave. He said, I would be damned in time and eternity if I ever returned the Black warriors to slavery. So they left disconsolate, thinking the war was going, the bad nature of the war would lose them the direction. Fate changes. In September, Atlanta fell. The whole mood of the North changed overnight, and he won that election. But there's no question that his leadership of the North during the war was the central question. So I think that's still going to be true today. The candidate in President Bush in President Trump is unprecedented. The candidate of President Trump is unprecedented. The polarization is pretty great, but it was pretty great in the terms of the Civil War as well. So we'll see what happens during the election, but my guess is that leadership will still be the central factor, as it was in 1864, as it was in 1932.
Yes, I certainly hope so. Another factor that seems familiar in this sense, but also unprecedented, is just how divided Americans have become. We're in a situation where the president and his supporters have their own media often, they have their own language, they have their own truths, so to speak. And that are diametrically opposed to what other Americans are seeing. Is that a unique factor?
Well, for any of us who are alive still, it does seem like it's the most unprecedented time in terms of that division. And we can remember back to the days of 3 television networks not so long ago, where at least you knew that the facts were the same and the opinions might be different. And then once we got cable news, once we got a divided cable media, and then once we got social media, then we've reached that point where, just as you say, it's almost like alternative universes. You'd really have to go way, way back to the Civil War days, to the 1850s, to see any replication of that. So what happened in the 1850s is that when you got your news, the only way you got your news was to read the partisan newspaper for the party you belonged to. So you'd read the Republican newspaper or the Democratic newspaper or the Whig newspaper. So during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, if Lincoln is in a debate with Douglas and you're reading the Republican newspaper, you might read that he was carried off on the shoulders of his friends because he was so triumphant and so great that they went out cheering. You read the same debate, the same Democratic newspaper will tell you Lincoln was so terrible during the debate that he fell on the floor in abject misery and they had to drag him out of the audience. So you really did have alternative universes. And of course, that was the problem in the 50s. The North and the South were splitting. People in the North were splitting amongst themselves, and it led to that Civil War. And you have 2 incidents during that time that had an entirely different way of thinking. A man named Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, came to the Senate and hit Senator from Massachusetts, Sumner, over the head with his cane. He fell into unconsciousness. He was in the hospital for weeks, and he was not able to come back to the Senate for years. And yet he was made a hero in the North, and it mobilized the Republican Party. Preston Brooks was made a hero in the South, and people had golden canes made, and they made him into this legendary figure. So it shows that division was really there at one point, but luckily it healed, and now we seem to be back in it again.
I would hope not to quite such a violent extent. Fingers crossed that it doesn't get physical in this way again. But this is a moment of not just national crisis, but international crisis. More than 200,000 Americans dead from a pandemic that the Democrats and others blame on the mismanagement of the pandemic and lack of crisis management by the president. It's a situation that feels less like previous epidemic disease outbreaks and more like an emergency on the scale of the Great Depression or the national mobilization required for the Second World War. Presidents never are able to predict that they're going to be the ones chosen to manage a national emergency. How have others fared at these sort of emergencies?
History will give us some more hope, I think, if we look back to the way FDR handled the Great Depression and World War II, than if we look back to what led up to the Civil War because of that polarization. So what happens when FDR comes into the inauguration in 1932 is that he changes course. And immediately he tells the American people that he's been given the gift of leadership and he's going to exercise that gift and he's going to take responsibility. The federal government will take national leadership of the Depression. And he said he's going to call Congress into session, to an emergency session, recommend a series of measures to end the banking crisis and to get people back to work. If Congress doesn't agree, he will take executive power, ask them for that. So it's almost as if he's running a war. And as a result of that speech alone, just because someone had taken national responsibility, the headlines read, "We have a leader, the government lives." Hundreds and thousands of telegrams came to the White House. And there's a story of a letter that was my favorite. Somebody wrote in that his roof had fallen off, his dog had run away, his wife was mad at him, he'd lost his job, but now everything was all right because Franklin Roosevelt was there. It's that mystery of leadership. He conveyed optimism about the future, but he was brutally honest about the present in terms of what the realities were. And then he did indeed start putting people to job. Millions of people got public jobs. He put a safety net under the people, regulated the stock market. He kept that Congress in session for 100 days with all the changes that took place. But then, incredibly, that same leader, showing the traits of character and traits of strength, was able to lead us through the early days of World War II. Another situation that, when we think of how troubling ours is today, things were really scary in those early days of World War II. Germany had conquered all of Western Europe, save England. America stood only 18th in military power, desperately wanting to help England. We became 17th only when Holland surrendered. We had almost no modern tanks, planes, or weapons to speak of. And so what FDR was able to do, which I think companies need to do now, too, is to somehow change course again to meet the crisis. So he realized he had to change his relationship with the business community, which had been marked by hostility in the later days of the New Deal. So he brought in two top business leaders from Chrysler and from Sears and Roebuck to run his production agencies. He brought two top Republicans into his cabinet. He made partnership with the business community. He said he would accelerate depreciation and antitrust regulations, provide the capital for car companies to change into planes and tanks and weapons. And even before Pearl Harbor, 18 months before Pearl Harbor, that mobilization started. And then once Pearl Harbor happened, it was just incredible what the business community was able to do. A plane every 4 minutes was made, a tank every 7 minutes, and a ship every single day. And then those weapons and those ships and planes and tanks could be sent to our allies in all far corners of the world, and really helped enormously in making that war possible, that victory possible in the war. So I think if we look back at those moments when you had leadership and you had people also willing to sacrifice. I mean, Roosevelt told the people that in order to have an equitable supply of distribution of scarce goods, there would have to be rationing. And despite some black market, they accepted that they could only have 5 gallons of gasoline in their cars every week, which meant that driving for leisure came to an end, which was a really hard thing for an independent group of people. But they accepted it. Coffee could only be 1 cup a day. Could you imagine if people had to have that today? Rubber couldn't be manufactured except for tires. So women's rubber girdles were no longer manufactured for a while. It was a really interesting time when the president was able to inspire the people to know that what they did on the home front would affect the war front. And it's that kind of national sacrifice, that kind of inspiration and working together as a whole nation that I think the United States has been missing in these last months. There's a friend of mine who has a mother who's been unwilling to wear a mask, and she kept arguing with her, why won't you wear the mask? And she finally said, because I would look like a Democrat if I wear a mask. It's that division that has made our response to the crisis, I think, so much harder.
That's extraordinary. I've seen that level of national coordinated mobilization and messaging of the need to sacrifice in other Western countries during this coronavirus crisis. But it's been a surprise not to see it, frankly, coming from the United States during this time. And I think people in a lot of other countries have been looking across the ocean and saying, okay, where is the American leadership in this? Where is silence? The other,
I think the I was just going to say, Doug, I think that the big problem has been there's been consistently from the beginning that question of how much of the science are you going to follow, even if it means closing the economy down, locking down in the beginning, and then hoping that you can reopen safely once the virus is more under control. And at the beginning of this whole problem, President Trump did say that he thought he had the power to decide whether to reopen the economy and when. And he said, it's going to be the biggest decision I'll ever have to make, and I hope to God I make it right. But in the end, it was the governors and the states that were left up to that power without that national inspiration from the center. So we've had a patchwork response to it. Some states locking down more, others opening up more. The ones that opened up more then got a spike in the virus, and then it's just been unable to get a hold of. And let's just hope that at least the leadership that the United States may be exercising on the making of the vaccine will be something that we can be proud of and can help the rest of the world with, just as our weapons and supplies and planes and tanks did in World War II.
Indeed, indeed. The other crisis that's been unfolding during 2020 in the United States is a real mood of anger directed at racial discrimination and injustice on a scale that we've really not seen since the 1960s. When Lyndon Johnson, who you've written a biography of, became president in the midst of that anger, a lot of people thought he was too coarse and insensitive, maybe even too bigoted to meet that moment. Was it that he changed, or did we find something out about him that we didn't know? Was there a process that happened with LBJ that we haven't seen with this president? And do you expect it for a president to rise to the occasion?
Well, in that case, there's no question that LBJ did rise to the occasion. And I think several things had happened, and I was lucky enough to get to know him very well in those last years when I accompanied him to his ranch to help him on his memoirs. And he loved to talk about this whole period of time and what had happened and what might have changed in him. And I think one thing began to change. He'd always had a lot of power. I mean, he'd been the youngest minority leader, the youngest majority leader, and there was never easily a question of where was that power being put? What was the purpose? When he was young, he was progressive, but then he became more conservative when he was running for the Senate. But then he had a very major heart attack when he was still in his 40s, when he was majority leader. And he fell into such a depression in the hospital, they weren't sure they could even rouse him. All of a sudden, one day he was roused up. He said, "Get me shaved. I'm ready. I'm ready." And then he was asked why. He said he began to think as he was lying there, what had he done to be remembered by? And it shifted his goal for what he wanted to use his power for. He got the first civil rights bill through the Senate, even before he became president. And then civil rights became something in his heart. There's no question about that. As a Southerner, he thought he could probably do something to heal the South as well as heal the civil rights problem itself. So when he gets into the presidency and JFK has been killed, he makes his number one priority, he says it publicly, to get the stalled civil rights bill through the Senate and through the Congress. JFK had introduced a bill that summer, but it seemed to go nowhere. There was no way to get it past the Democratic filibuster. Meanwhile, the civil rights movement was heating up. There'd been 250,000 people in the Lincoln Memorial. There were more marches. There was a fear that violence might occur. So it had much of the tension that we have today. But somehow Lyndon Johnson used his ability to make it the number one priority. They said to him, "You don't have enough currency to do this. You can't use it on the presidency in a way like this." And he said, "Then what the hell is the presidency for?" And then he started using his powers of knowing the individual congressmen and senators. He brought 30 senators over every couple of days to dinner in the White House so that every single congressman was in the White House. They'd come in groups. Lady Bird would take them on a tour of the mansion. He would have pork and brandy with the guys. And then the next night and the next day and the days after that, he'd continue to call them up. He'd call them at 6. He called them at 12. He called them at 2 a.m. He even said to a senator, "I hope I didn't wake you up." Senator said, "No, I was just lying here hoping my president would call." And somehow he was able to put together a 2/3 majority to break the filibuster. He reached out to the Republicans. You hear those wonderful tapes that he made of his recorded conversations when he was having these phone calls with these people, and they show the brilliance of charm, persuasion, threats, promises, everything. Finally, he ends up with Everett Dirksen, the minority leader, saying, "Everett, if you come with me on this bill and bring some Republicans to break that filibuster, 200 years from now, school children will know only 2 names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. How could Dirksen resist? At any rate, he finally did bring the Republicans. The Civil Rights Bill passes. And then the next year, Johnson doesn't stop. After the Selma demonstrations take place, he decides that he will go to a joint session of Congress and call for voting rights, and later does fair housing. And much of the Medicare and Medicaid and aid to education, Great Society legislation was bearing on civil rights. And then, of course, the war came and escalated, and much of that progress was stopped. And I think the situation we're finding ourselves in today, consciousness has once again been raised by the Black Lives Movement, just as the Civil Rights Movement raised it in the 1960s. But what you really need for change to take place is that movement has to link up with the levers of power inside for something to happen. I mean, that's what happened with the anti-slavery movement. As when Lincoln was called a liberator, he said, don't call me that. It was the anti-slavery movement and the Union soldiers that did it all. So we're in a situation now in the country where the consciousness has been raised. Lots of changes have already been made, but to really deal with the inequities in the society and what has to change in order for some sort of semblance of possibility and mobility for people living in the inner cities, in the housing, with failed education, in neighborhoods that are not safe, in people living in places that are more susceptible and their bodies more susceptible to COVID because of the lack of access to healthcare. All of those changes are going to take a real mobilized society, and they're going to take leadership on the part of both the people and the leaders in power.
Well, let's talk about that type of leadership, that ability to bring together disparate groups. Donald Trump has been photographed in his office at Trump Tower with a copy of your Lincoln biography, Team of Rivals, on his desk. Although unlike Barack Obama before him, who was also inspired by that book, it's not entirely clear that President Trump has read beyond the title. But that notion that's central to this book of a president who surrounds himself with people whose views might differ from his own, who are not afraid to speak truth to power, or maybe activists who finds the right people to meet the moment, even if they're from outside his own party. That obviously holds a great appeal, at least coming into office, for many presidents, as it did for Abraham Lincoln. Tell us more about the Team of Rivals approach and how it's played out for those who've attempted that method of leadership.
Well, what mattered above all was that Abraham Lincoln had the confidence to be able to know that he could bring people around him who were more celebrated, more educated, more experienced than he was. The night he won the election in November of 1860, he couldn't sleep. And he made the decision that very night that he would bring these three cheap rivals into his cabinet. And what it meant is, his friend said to him, how can you do that? You're going to look like a figurehead with all these powerful people around him, each one of whom thought he should be president instead of Abraham Lincoln. But he said, these are difficult times, and I need the strongest and most able men in the country by my side. And what it meant by bringing them by his side was that they each represented a different faction of Northern feeling, conservative, radical, and moderate. So if he had to figure out how to unify the North in its response to the Southern movement away from the Union and the secession that had taken place eventually, then he knew he had to unify the North with the understanding of where each side was coming from. So inside his cabinet meetings, they would have arguments. They would question him. They for a while, thought they were all better than him until they finally saw that this was a leader unique in their time. And they started writing letters to their wives and their families saying, this guy is really something. But more importantly, when he finally went for emancipation, he had listened to them argue about it for months. He knew that several were still against it, but he had talked to them enough in that time period that when he finally just went and made his decision, said, we're going to do this now. I no longer need your arguments on either side, but I'll listen to your suggestions on its implementation and its timing. Several of them still didn't think he should do it, but they didn't make their opposition public because he had listened respectfully for so long a period of time. So that's the key, I think, for a leader, to surround himself with people who can bring different perspectives. He broadened that by having meetings every morning in the White House where anybody who wanted a job in the days before civil service could come in and ask him for a clerkship or a postmastership. And after a while, his young secretary said, you're spending too much time with these ordinary people. He said, you're wrong. I must never forget the popular assemblage from which I have come. So then he'd hear all sorts of opinions from those people, and that helped him with the timing. The timing of the Emancipation Proclamation was perfect. He later said if he'd issued it 6 months earlier, he would have lost the border states and lost the war. If he'd waited any longer, he would have lost the morale boost it provided. As it was the perfect timing on January 1st, 1863, in part because he embodied all those different kind of feelings right within his own inner cabinet and in the White House itself.
It's interesting from that the things that become effective leadership are not always the things that are displayed as effective leadership in performative events like the debates that are unfolding now. Acting like you're a tough guy in front of a camera certainly is an attempt to convey to the audience a sense of being a leader. But in leadership in turbulent times, you chronicle a whole lot of different aspects of leadership that lead to success or failure in presidents in various moments. What do you think are the things that are qualities of leadership that are not so visible, that are underrated, versus the things that tend to capture the glimmer of the eye?
Yeah, I think sometimes we overrate academic success. I mean, for example, FDR, when Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Supreme Court Justice, was asked to make a judgment after having first met FDR, he said he had a second-rate intellect, but he did at least say that he had a first-rate temperament, and temperament is probably far more important than intellect. But it was simply because he hadn't done well in school. LBJ certainly didn't well in school. That didn't mean they didn't have far-ranging minds. In both cases, they were able to bring patterns together, to understand how things fit together. There's other ways of judging intellect, I think, than academic performance. But it seems to me that the most underappreciated leadership quality, and I found this with all of my guys, LBJ was the exception and it hurt him, they were able to find time to think, and they would find time to relax and replenish their energies. They were all pretty busy. We think we don't have time now to relax or replenish, especially since our home and our workspace are combined now because of the virus. And yet they had a depression, a civil war, World War II, and they all managed to make their schedules such that they could do so. Lincoln actually went to the theater 100 times during the Civil War. He said when the lights went down and a Shakespeare play came on, for a few precious hours, he could forget the war that was raging. They would criticize him. How can you do this in the middle of the war? He said, because the anxiety would kill me if I didn't. And then he was able to tell stories of humor in the midst of the worst cabinet meetings. Somehow he said humor whistled off sadness, that a good story for him was better than a drop of whiskey. And at night, when he couldn't sleep, he would read one of Shakespeare's comedies to his 2 young aides, so those words could be in his head before he went to sleep. Teddy Roosevelt exercised 2 hours every day, a raucous game of tennis or a wrestling match or a boxing match or a hike in the wooded cliffs of Rock Creek Park. But FDR had the best way of relaxing and replenishing his energies. He had a cocktail party every night during World War II, and the rule was you couldn't talk about the war. You could talk about gossip that you'd heard. He loved gossip. You could talk about movies and books as long as the war didn't come up. And then after a while, this cocktail party was so important to him that he wanted the people who would be at the cocktail party to actually live on the second floor of the White House with him to be ready for the cocktail party. So that second floor became the most exclusive residential hotel you could possibly imagine. His foreign policy advisor, Harry Hopkins, came for dinner one night early in the war, slept over, never left until the war was winding to an end. Missy Lehand, their secretary, lived with the family in the White House. Lorena Hickok, a friend of Eleanor's, lived right there. The great Winston Churchill came and spent weeks at a time on the second floor of the White House. I became obsessed when I was writing my book on Franklin and Eleanor with where did each one of them stay on that second floor? And I'd been up there with Lyndon Johnson when I was 24 years old and 25, and I never thought of asking the question then. I wasn't thinking in those terms then. So I mentioned this on a radio program in Washington, and it happened that Hillary Clinton was listening. And so she promptly called me up at the radio station and she invited me to sleep overnight in the White House. She said we could then wander the corridor and figure out together where everyone had slept 50 years earlier. So a few weeks later, she invited my husband and me to a state dinner, after which between midnight and 2 a.m., the president, Mrs. Clinton, my husband and I, with my map in hand, went through every room up there and figured out, yes, Chelsea Clinton is sleeping where Harry Hopkins once slept. The Clintons are sleeping where President Roosevelt slept. And we were sleeping that night in Winston Churchill's bedroom, which meant there was no way I could sleep. I was certain he was sitting in the corner drinking his brandy and smoking his ever-present cigar. So, but that ability to be able to take time away, Roosevelt was able to come up with the whole Lend-Lease idea, the whole brainstorm for it when he was on a fishing trip. Lincoln was able to come up with how he would do the Emancipation Proclamation, and doing it out of military necessity, when he went to this soldier's home, which was 3 miles from White House, where he could be away from all the people that were barging in to talk to him. So I think for all of us, understanding that our modern world and the cell phones and now the virus, which has brought all of us, many of us working from home together, makes it even more imperative that leadership be able to take time. Maybe we should have, cocktail hours that are on video, virtual cocktail hours, where we promise not to talk about the virus or the crises that are enduring us.
It's interesting, that because a lot of these presidents who were able to get away were also seen as micromanagers in their places. And maybe I'm getting a sense that the idea that there's a dichotomy between hands-off delegators and detail-oriented micromanagers is maybe not a good way to divide presidents. Maybe the people who are most effective are able to work in both modes and shift between them.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think about the fact of FDR, for example, when he comes into the Depression and he's worried about a whole lost generation of youth, because there were all these young men in the cities who had no jobs. He was afraid their entire generation would be stifled as a result of it. So he makes the decision that he comes up himself with the whole idea: the forests need healing, these people need jobs. I'm going to create what he calls the Civilian Conservation Corps to get the young people into the forest to plant trees, take old shrubs away, and make the forest heal while they'll get a job. But then what he does, so he's already got that. He sets a target. I want 250,000 of them there in 3 months. And then he starts telling the Labor Department, you have your responsibility. You're going to enroll them. He tells the military, you're going to construct the camps. And then he tells the Interior Department, you're going to find the jobs for them to do. Then he leaves it to them. But he's set out a target of a date. He set out what they each need to do. They have to collaborate, which they don't normally do. They did it. And by July, 250,000 young men were there. So I think you're right. You need the vision, and then you need to have targets set, and you have to have responsibilities and missions, but then you have to leave it up to the people to do in the end, and they certainly did.
Let me turn to a summary question for me before I turn to a couple questions coming from the audience. Broadly speaking, is your knowledge of presidential history give you any reassurances at a moment like this? Has the United States of America been somewhere like this before? Do you feel like this is familiar terrain, or is this uncharted terrain? Does your knowledge of history make you feel more calm or more nervous about this moment?
Well, I think the thing that makes people anxious about this moment is the fact that we don't feel that we're pulling together as a nation toward the common goal. I mean, it was true during the early days of 1939, 1940. There was isolationism that was very strong in the country, and there were people who knew we had to intervene and wanted to intervene in the war. So we had that division. We obviously had the terrible divisions before the Civil War, but that's the way it ended up, in a civil war. And there still seems to be a sense right now of knowing that the divisions are really hurting a common response to the virus, to the Black Lives Movement, to even perhaps the economic recovery. And that's always the strength of a country, when a people pull together. My worry is that Theodore Roosevelt once warned that democracy would be in trouble if people in different sections and classes and religions began seeing each other as the other rather than as common American citizens, not understanding, he said, the passions and the prejudices and the hopes and the fears of the people in those different sections or classes or religions. And I just think there's got to be some way that we're going to be able to understand that that's the first priority for us as a nation, is to somehow get that back. I mean, we've had polarization in the Congress for years, and it's been growing as time goes by. It was there before President Trump. I think those divisions have been stoked in these last 3.5 years, and I think the election is stoking it even more. We've got a social media that has completely alternative visions of what's going on. You know, at least in the old days when Franklin Roosevelt gave his fireside chats, you would know that everybody is listening to the same radio time, the same program. Maybe some people would throw their radio out of the window if they didn't like him, but Saul Bellow said you could walk down the street on a hot Chicago night and you could look in and watch everybody watching their radio. You could hear his voice coming out. And since everyone was listening, you could keep walking down and not miss a word of what he was saying. And that gives you, as a leader, a tool when you've got that collective energy of the country to mobilize together for a problem. And somehow that divisions, we're going to take a long time to heal here. But my guess is, just from knowing history, or at least my hope is from knowing history, is that once something breaks, that once we begin to understand the need to move toward it, it will take some time. The damage will be there, but that we will come back together. There's still more uniting our country as a country. There's still common problems that have to be met by everybody. Mobility would help both people, poor and rich. Teddy Roosevelt, that's the one hopeful thing. When I think back to him, the turn of the century was a pretty wild time. There was a gap between the rich and the poor. There was globalization echo back then in industrialization. Technological changes had taken place. A lot of people felt worried about them. The telephone, the telegraph, the pace of life was speeding up too much. There was a big gap between the country people and the city people. There were strikes in the street. There was populism. There were anarchists. It was a very rough time. And the leadership came in the form of Teddy Roosevelt and the people. They had begun to have a progressive movement in the cities and the states. And he argued for a square deal for the rich and the poor, the capitalist and the wage worker. And he took a train and he would go around every 6 weeks in the fall and spring to the states that he hadn't won to mobilize support for that program. And he was able to take care of the worst aspects of the industrial order and make some rational reform. And it kept the country stable during that period of time. So I think there's precedence for us beginning to get out of this, but we have to start that process.
And one question that has come up a lot from the audience here a whole suite of questions about the Electoral College. And it's a thing that mystifies those of us who aren't Americans. I don't go as far back in presidential elections as you do, but I remember in 2000 being sent to Austin, Texas, where the Republicans were holed up and being told, go do a couple stories and fly back when they've got a president. So I packed for a weekend, and I ended up being there for a month and a half on and off before it actually happened. And we certainly learned a lot about the limitations of the Electoral College then. 2016 certainly was another election. There have been several where presidents have won the popular vote or have lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College, and it's always controversial. Do you think it's a mistake? Do you think that structure of election is a fundamental flaw in how presidents are chosen?
Well, I think, like so much else in U.S. history, the Electoral College goes back to compromises that were made at the time of the Constitution. And at that time, there were arguments. In fact, many people were arguing that the president should be chosen by the Congress or by the states. And then others said it should be a popular vote in the nation as a whole. So the compromise reached was there would be a popular vote. And they were worried that many of the people who would be exercising the popular vote might not be really informed. They might not be the most educated people in the country. So the electors would be chosen, and they would represent that other group of people who would be more informed, presumably, and represent the states. And so, as it turned out, in most elections, the popular vote carried. And it's funny that you remember 2000, because I remember being on NBC at the night of 2000 with Tom Brokaw and Tim Russert. And they kept asking me, because we had to fill time while we were waiting to hear what was going to happen in Florida. So I'm telling them about the other times when the popular vote and the electoral vote had split, 1824, 1888. And we go on and on and on. Finally, they said to me, well, do you have any more stories? And I had gone through it. I said, no, there's no more I can tell you. And so at any rate, each time one of these things happen, there becomes an impulse to do something about the Electoral College. The problem is it's going to take a constitutional amendment. That's a very difficult process to happen in our place. I think people do feel, I would bet the majority of people, if you saw a poll, feel it's not fair that the popular vote, that the people in California don't have, with millions of people, or people in New York, or people in the big states, don't have as much weight in the Electoral College as some of the smaller states. Then it used to be said that one of the arguments for the Electoral College was, well, if we get rid of it, then the campaigns will only be in the big states. They won't go to any place else. Well, now what are they doing? They're only going to the swing states, essentially, because that's where it's come down to those states because of the divisions in the country. So I think there's going to be a real decision at some point soon. Maybe the way to do it is individual states have the power to decide how to award the electors. And some of those states are awarding it on the basis of the popular vote. That's an easier way to get this thing underway. And there's a movement for more states to do that than to get a constitutional amendment. But I think what happens is once one of these elections happens and then we forget about it and then we wait till the next time it happens. And that's not a very good way to deal with the structural changes that need to be made in our country.
Right, right. And the fact that it tends to redound against Democrats who've sort of become the party of the popular majority and in favor of Republicans who become more of the party of territory probably makes it very unlikely that there's going to be a change unless, as you say, it's from the bottom up.
Exactly so. I mean, that's where there's going to have to be. I think there's a lot of changes that need to be taken in the political structure because we've seen a broken political structure over these last decades. And it has to do with the power of money in society. It has to do with Citizens United. It has to do with the Electoral College. It may have to do with some of the rules now in the Senate in terms of the filibuster. And I think during the campaign, it was interesting, those political changes became real campaign promises on the part of many of the Democrats. And you don't ordinarily see the political process itself being something that's questioned. Because once you get the people in power there, they're never going to want to change it. But that's why the changes would have to come from the ground up. And maybe there's a movement now that may have some power as time goes by.
There's a fear right now that if this election result becomes ambiguous or contentious, that President Trump might try to do something that stretches the limits of the Constitution, however defined. And I find in reading your biographies, I'm struck by how resilient the Constitution of the United States has been in protecting the country from overreach of presidential powers. That it's a flawed document. It's missing many things. It still does not guarantee the equal rights of men and women and so on. But its system of checks and balances seems to have been fairly robust against attempts at greater authority of presidents. Do you still have confidence that this will continue? That the Constitution is a strong enough document to keep presidents who are seeking extra powers in check?
I do have confidence in the sense that you look at this whole peaceful exercise of transfer of power. It started with George Washington. Had he chosen, he could have stayed in office after 2 terms as long as he wanted to. It would have made an entirely different understanding of what the presidency is. Maybe we would have had each president stay until he died. But he even then understood how important it was to have that peaceful transfer. And all the other times when a president has lost the popular vote and had to give in to the Electoral College vote, they have done so, even though they didn't think it was fair. That was true for Tilden in 1876. It was certainly true for Gore, who made an extraordinary concession speech saying that the rule of law had spoken. He didn't agree with the Supreme Court's decision, but he would abide by it. And I think there's there'll be a pressure on President Trump if he were not to do that. It depends, of course. I mean, if the election isn't close, then it won't matter. But the scenario that people are concerned about is that more Republicans tend to vote in person and that the virus will keep more other people wanting mail-in ballots. The mail-in ballots will take time to be counted. But I think there'll be such pressure to make sure they're counted in time to make it possible this time that if there are shenanigans, there's going to be a lot of people, public servants, a lot of people speaking up. And I still have to believe that somehow there'll be a peaceful transfer of power. I mean, the interesting thing is I was on Bill Maher in the fall of 2018 when my book on leadership in turbulent times came out. And one of the things he said then was, he said, I think if President Trump doesn't win, he'll just stay in power and he won't leave the White House. And I just dismissed it entirely. I said, that's ridiculous. I said, the military will come and take him out. And he said, yeah. So anyway, there's a lot of fear that's been raised about this because of the statements that President Trump has taken. But in the end, I still believe that the forces, just as you said, the forces of the country, the belief in our system of government, and the fundamental belief in the peaceful transfer of power is so big in our system that I've got to believe that they will prevail and that we will have a winner, if not on election night, soon thereafter.
Right. Although it might be, going back to the president of 2000, it soon could be, I mean, that was a late night, and I suspect this could be a late night that stretches out for some time, given the number of absentee mail-in ballots that have to be counted and then contested and so on. So should we expect—
And we've had mail ballots for years. I mean, that's what it's important to recognize, that mail-in ballots have been used without controversy, except on the margins for years in many states, in many places. And there'll probably be a lot more this year because of the virus. But nonetheless, the system has the capacity to do it if it's not hindered. And I still believe that somehow it's going to work. You got to believe it right now, and you got to have the confidence that it will. And then if it's not, then you've got to figure out how to fight for that.
Speaking as somebody in a country where we still put X's on paper ballots, it is worth remembering that the controversies involving ballots over the last few decades have generally involved those voting machines where you push a button and you get a hanging chat and all that sort of stuff. And you're entirely right. Postal ballots have been entirely uncontroversial, although the scale, of course, because of the pandemic, is going to be quite different.
I mean, what you should realize when we, celebrated this last year, the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, or John Lewis's death made so clear what was done in all the fighting and the deaths and the difficulty that had to be faced to get the voting rights for Black Americans. When the right to vote has become such a part of our inheritance, and there's been so much that's been done to make that happen, to not want more people to vote and have their votes counted is beyond imagining. I mean, it's the most important thing in a democracy, the power of vote. And the fact that so many leaders have spoken out in the past, whether it's Eisenhower or Lincoln or Theodore Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt, about the importance of the power of vote. And right now, that should be nonpartisan. It should be bipartisan. And a candidate should be willing to say that they want more people to vote than ever before. I mean, I don't know why we don't have a national holiday for it. I don't know why everybody can't mail in a vote if it works out that system. I don't know why you can't start voting early in different places. There should be no reason, and there's been so little shenanigans with it over time that we have to believe we can make them safe if we know what they are. But to not want people to vote is beyond imagining in a democracy, because it is the center of a democratic country, to be able to vote for your leader and decide who your leader is going to be.
Well, this is why it's so shocking from outside the United States, and I'm sure from within, to hear one presidential candidate attacking the legitimacy of the electoral system and of ballots during debates and campaign speeches and so on. I'm sure that has to be something that has not happened like this before.
Yeah, I think so many things are happening that haven't happened before, and we've just got to hope that we can move toward an understanding where the majority of the country is understanding the importance of voting. The majority of the country doesn't believe that there should be a lack of a peaceful transference of power. Not even the majority, the overwhelming majority. So we just have to trust that the people themselves are going to make this right. And that means exercising their power somehow through pressure, through moral judgments, to be able to get on the right side of this issue.
Look, another topic that is of great interest to the audience today is the Supreme Court. The death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the contest over which presidential administration should be in charge when replacing her, whether it should be done before or after the election, or before or after the the transition in January, has brought a lot of attention to the controversies around this. I know the Constitution is fairly clear on these matters, but have we had presidential elections before that have revolved around questions of the appointment of Supreme Court justices?
Well, what's really interesting when you think about history right now is that what some Democrats are arguing is that if the Supreme Court nominee that the Republicans want gets into office in such a rushed hearing, or even if she doesn't get in now until after the election, and if President Trump were to lose the election and still put her in, that there are resources and weapons that the Democrats could use. And they point to the court packing decision that FDR made. And when you go back to that, what I think many people don't realize is that the number 9 on the Supreme Court is not solidified anywhere. There have been times when the court was 4, there was times when it was 8, there were times when it was 12. So there is a power on the part of the Congress to vote a majority rule and say we want more court justices on the court. So theoretically, the Democrats could, if they wanted to, if they got the Senate, if they got the majority, and if they get the presidency, they could go down that path of saying that they're adding 3 more Supreme Court justices. It's a pretty tough path to go down, because then you worry that then the Republicans get in power, 4 years later, 8 years later, and then they pack the court even more, and the court's completely a political institution at that point. So the one precedent we had was Franklin Roosevelt. And what happened is that he had won the election in 1932. He'd won a landslide in 1936. The Supreme Court had 3 or 4 very conservative justices that were undoing the New Deal, undoing possibly Social Security. They were about to take that up. They had undone his National Recovery Act. They were about to undo minimum wage. The centerpieces, unions' rights, the centerpieces of what he thought were the economy's need to recover. So he decided that he was going to do something about the court. And now it's considered, well, that was a failure, so it'll never work. And the reason it was a failure, I think, was because he wasn't straight with the American people, that the court was not giving in to what was an overwhelming feeling on the part of the majority of the people and the people in power and the people who had won the election. He simply said that every time a Supreme Court justice reached 70 and did not retire, a president could then appoint a new Supreme Court justice. And it just so happened that the conservative judges were 70 years old. So he said the court wasn't operating efficiently as a result. So the justice of the Supreme Court were able to show we're operating fine. And then as it turned out, one of them retired anyway. One of them changed their minds on one of the big key issues, and he got his will anyway. But it's the wrong precedent to look at. So there is a possibility. But my hope is, again, that somehow we'll figure out something else, because once you go down that path, it's going to be very difficult to stop being good. But I can understand where the feeling would be that if there were a majority in the Congress, in the Senate and the House, and if Biden were to win the election and all the legislation that they were putting forward was being made unconstitutional, or even if Obamacare is considered unconstitutional right after this election, whether Trump wins or not, that there's going to be a real pressure to do something about it, and they'll have to think creatively about what to do.
This is the paradox of these things, isn't it? It would certainly appear to be stacking the court and creating a partisan institution on behalf of the Democrats, unless there really was a national consensus. But so many of the other structural changes that have been done by parties in power who felt blocked by other branches of government have seen, I mean, the 2-term limit for presidents was introduced, if I recall correctly, in response to FDR. It certainly was seen as a Republican move when it was introduced. In recent years, the so-called nuclear option decisions to get rid of filibuster powers around certain bills was seen as a Republican imposition of power on Congress. Is there a danger of a slippery slope where the limits on institutions are changed in ways that seems to be a partisan takeover?
I agree. I mean, I think that's the thing. I mean, the rules, it depends on how the rules are being used. That's why you have to somehow have, and I think the question you posed earlier, if you're going to make these changes in the rules, you really better explain them to the country so there is a national consensus on the need for doing so. That's one of the things that Lincoln talked about consistently. He said, public sentiment is everything. I mean, with public sentiment, anything is possible. Without it, nothing is possible. And he didn't mean public opinion. He meant a really considered feeling that a certain change was necessary. Emancipation, obviously, being the one he was talking about at the time. So if you're going to make these changes that are there for a reason, and maybe their reason has been outmoded, the question of whether you should have 2 senators is even up for issue now because of the unfairness in terms of the population of the larger states. There was a reason why these were put in. There were balancing desires. There was compromises that were built into the system. And if you're going to change them, that's one of the reasons why it's very safe that our constitutional amendment takes a long time to do something, because it's not easy to change. Some of these internal rules can be changed, but then once they could be changed, they can be changed back. And then we're going to have a real seesawing process. And so far, the country is in a seesaw. We've had, one group of power and then the next. We haven't got that long-term majority for a long period of time. So we have to just consider carefully what we do. This is the institutional loyalist in me, I guess, knowing the past, but it doesn't mean that sometimes action has to be taken. If the will of a majority and perhaps the health of a country and the economics of a country are at stake, then you may have to consider thinking about these things, as long as they can be explained to the national consciousness and understood, so it's not just one party doing it to another party.
Mm-hmm. When we look back at this era, whether this is a 4-year era or an 8-year era, there is going to be something called the Trump era in U.S. history. And it's always very difficult to define what an era is while it's taking place. We didn't really know what the Reagan era was when it was going on. We didn't know what the Kennedy era was when it was taking place. I know historians hate these kind of questions, but when a next generation has books about the Trump era, will it be looked at as a weird interlude in U.S. history? Do you feel that it's part of a more seismic shift toward a different normalcy in the balance of U.S. power and the way executive power happens?
Well, I think you're right when you say that historians would rather look back rather than project forward. And I will come back to that as my prop in a certain sense. I do think it depends greatly on what happens in the election. I mean, if the election changes, if the Democrats should win, if they should take back the Senate, I think then the 4 years will be looked at in a different way than if it's revoted in and we've got 8 years. That's going to be a big consideration as to how this is looked at. But it does take a while. I mean, for example, I'm working now on, my husband had an archive from the 1960s, which is unmatched by anything. He was a young speechwriter for John Kennedy. He kept everything. He worked for LBJ. He did all of LBJ's great civil rights speeches. He was deeply involved in the Great Society. And then he left over the Vietnam War, got active in the anti-war movement, worked with McCarthy in New Hampshire, worked with Bobby Kennedy, was with Bobby Kennedy, who was his closest friend when he died. And that decade of the 60s came to an end in a very different way than the promise of the beginning. And for a while, all we looked at when we looked back on it was the war in Vietnam, and LBJ was being skewered. At the 50th anniversary of Medicare and Medicaid and voting rights and civil rights, historians began looking differently, not only at LBJ, but at the era. The era ends up in riots and violence and Richard Nixon winning. So that whole period of time now, I think, is looked at differently than it was 25 years ago. And I think 75 years from now, it'll be looked up differently than it is now. So it will take time to figure out, first of all, what was it that allowed President Trump to win the election? Granted, he didn't win the popular vote, but there was a restiveness out there. There was a sense on the part of a group of people that they hadn't been listened to, that the economy wasn't working in their favor, that mobility wasn't happening. It's happened in a lot of other places, in Brexit, in England, in countries in Europe, where the prosperity hasn't been shared, where the gap between the rich and the poor, which is not as much of a problem as the lack of mobility, has produced a populist movement. And then that populist movement was led by a leader who may not have even been dealing with the goals of that movement, but had that extraordinary power of entertaining and being the center of attention. And it was the same power that Teddy Roosevelt had, used in a different direction. And they used to say about Teddy Roosevelt that he was so able to capture attention on himself that he wanted to be the baby at the baptism, the bride at the wedding, and the corpse at the funeral. And you couldn't take your eyes off him when he walked onto a scene, similarly to the way that President Trump has captured social media. But I think to really be able to put this period in perspective, when norms have been undone, when the polarization has deepened, when tribal sections have built up even more than before, when the fight for a renewed system of racial justice is out there side by side with the fight with people arguing for white supremacy, it's going to take a period of time for us to see, was this an aberration? Or were we able to heal from it and move forward in a different direction? And then history will make its judgment. And I wish I could say I'll be around in 50 years to be able to make that, because it's an incredibly fascinating and difficult time in our history.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you for giving me the time to engage in these questions so much at such a fundamentally important moment in the history of the United States, in the history of the world. So thank you to Doris Kearns Goodwin. And I look forward to hearing you as the election proceeds and hearing what you're producing next. I would like to remind the audience.
Thank you, Doug. I mean, those questions were quite wonderful to try and answer. They were difficult and hard, and that's what they should be. So your readers have a wide-ranging set of minds out there, and I'm very glad to have been able to try to deal with them.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you to Doris Kearns Goodwin, and thank you for attending this first of 3 Globe and Mail U.S. election dialogues. Thank you very much.